France, May 1940. The Germans cross the Ardennes forest and break through at Sedan after 8 months of the so-called phony war. Only 6 weeks later, France signs an armistice and officially loses the war, at least for now. How did this happen? How could France, considered at the time a major military power, lose so quickly? The Battle of France is one of the most dramatic defeats in modern military history, yet most people don't really know what caused it. They usually attribute it to widespread defeatism and cowardice on the part of the soldiers. This is far from reality. Today, we'll look at the main reasons why the French lost in 1940. French doctrine played a huge role in the defeat, as many of the problems in the French army were directly or indirectly due to it. It wasn't suited for fast warfare, didn't encourage officers to improvise, and made the French extremely slow. Doctrine is probably the most critical factor in explaining the French defeat. After the massive loss of life France suffered in World War I, about 40% of the active male population, the French military rejected the idea of improvised and unprepared offensives. In fact, they believed that a hasty attack against a well-prepared position was likely doomed to fail, and that the only way an attacker could succeed was through a greater concentration of firepower with 3 times more infantry, 6 times the artillery, and 15 times the ammunition. As Robert A. Doty explains, this doctrine envisioned a rigidly controlled battle in which all units and weapons were carefully organized and then employed in combat. The French preferred a step-by-step battle in which units moved obediently between phase lines and adhered to tightly scheduled timetables. They preferred a slow and intricate process that valued preparation over improvisation. Unit movement was also limited by the range of artillery. Artillery fire acted as a protective umbrella under which every action had to be planned and executed, and beyond which nothing would happen. Counterattacks would generally depend on the use of firepower rather than maneuvers, but for these counterattacks to succeed, the French would need to move units in front of a penetration faster than an enemy attacker could advance. This doctrine required great coordination, and the French believed the locus of decision-making had to remain at the highest level. As a result, field commanders had little flexibility or room for initiative, the complete opposite of German doctrine, and the entire system was designed to be very top-down. This meant that the French military establishment was unlikely to respond flexibly to unforeseen situations and could hardly capitalize on gains made by lower-level units. While the French had, at first, correctly assumed that Germany intended to attack mainly through Belgium, they completely failed to reassess German intentions over time and were eventually deceived by the enemy when they attacked through the Ardennes and Sedan. As a result, French forces were not adequately positioned to meet the German attack. The irony of this French intelligence failure is that it began as a German intelligence failure. The French had initially guessed the general German plan, and their thoughts were confirmed by the Mechelin incident. On January 10, 1940, a German plane accidentally landed in Belgium. On board was an officer carrying the Third Reich's plans for the upcoming Western offensives. At the time, the Germans planned to attack southern Netherlands to the coast, conduct a 2-sided assault on Belgium, and possibly transfer armored and motorized units quickly in the direction of Sedan. If not for this incident and bad weather, that plan would have been executed by Germany to attack Western Europe. After this event, however, Hitler decided a new plan was necessary. It was only later, and because of the Mechelin incident, that the final version, known as Case Yellow, was devised and executed. However, while the Mechelin incident led the Germans to change their plans, it had the opposite effect on the French, especially General Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief, who saw in this event a confirmation of his assumptions about Germany's intentions. Indeed, he had correctly assumed that Belgium would be the main target. In fact, if the Germans had attacked in January, the French forces would mostly have been in the right places to face the attackers. Consequently, the the French were eventually deceived by an unintended counterintelligence action. Germany had accidentally given its plans to the Allies, but adapted and used that opportunity to deceive them and eventually attack elsewhere. However, the French never seriously considered that the captured documents might be considered compromised by Germany, even though they had fallen into enemy hands. They not only ignored the constant need to assess German intentions, but also failed to notice several indicators of German plans after January 1940. For example, they failed to connect the frequent presence of German reconnaissance planes over the Ardennes, the presence of German tourists in Luxembourg, and the Enigma intercepts suggesting a possible attack through that forest. French intelligence failed to correlate this data, leaving crucial questions unanswered. A major problem was the lack of in-depth analysis of the intelligence collected. French intelligence officers didn't connect the information, leaving essential questions in the hands of decision-makers without a consolidated assessment. The absence of a proactive approach to assimilate and relate intelligence was dramatic, resulting in an underestimation of the risk of an attack through the Ardennes. Uniformity in the mindset of intelligence officers also contributed to the failure. The lack of diversity of opinions and the absence of civilian experts to provide additional insight harmed the comprehensive assessment of the situation. Bureaucracy between intelligence services and the lack of an efficient coordinating structure also hindered the proper flow of information. The structure of French intelligence services did not promote effective communication with decision-makers. The absence of a joint intelligence committee and the lack of a direct link between key civilian decision-makers and intelligence officers contributed to the inability to anticipate the German crossing point in the Ardennes. One of the main problems of the French doctrine was its requirement for a very vertical command structure. As stated earlier in the video, local commanders on the battlefield had very little flexibility. At the tactical level, officers were neither trained nor accustomed to improvising and were not encouraged to develop initiative. The French believed that higher-level leaders had to be in command, as they were the only ones who had the necessary perspective to manage and coordinate all the different soldiers and materials on the front line. Consequently, under French doctrine, if officers at the operational and strategic levels were unable to devise solid solutions to respond to German attacks, French soldiers on the ground were likely doomed. A critical problem was that, in the kind of fast-paced warfare that the Germans imposed on the French, tactical leaders were essential. In fact, since the situation on the front line was prone to very rapid, if not constant, changes, local battlefield commanders were the most capable of assessing what the enemy was doing, how they were doing it, and what the immediate effects of their actions were. They were the ones who could make decisions more quickly to adapt to the circumstances. Another doctrinal problem was related to the employment of tanks. In the French army, tanks were not part of an independent branch. Instead, they were subordinated to the infantry and were, above all, a means of supporting it. As a result, the French mostly conserved their tanks to fulfill the infantry's tactical objectives, and the infantry could use them as it saw fit. Consequently, tanks were used in a fragmented way. Since French artillery was spread out among infantry units, they were dispersed across the front line. For example, in Stone, the French used the 3rd Armored Division not as a single large armored formation, but split it up to reinforce various divisions of the 21st Corps. Since every local commander wanted to use tanks for tactical objectives, the tanks couldn't be used to fulfill broader operational goals. Isolated tactical actions did not allow for large-scale armored maneuvers that could have had a chance to confront the Germans at the operational level. Generally proved weak at the operational and tactical levels, doctrine played a crucial role in this deficient leadership, but it wasn't the only reason. Some French leaders made poor decisions and acted in objectively inadequate ways for various reasons. The seeds of poor leadership were apparently planted in the interwar period, after the victory of the Great War. The French military school of Saint-Cyr did not encourage its students, the future officers of the French army, to think outside the box. They were encouraged to follow the prescribed doctrine without questioning it. The French officer André Beaufret, for example, who attended the school during this period, recalled that they were being taught to follow a narrow, strict doctrine. According to him, the tactics were simple and consisted of following a set of guidelines to the letter. In fact, before the campaign, the Germans expected that French commanders at all levels would not act before receiving detailed instructions that would be issued only slowly. These elements help explain why French officers simply failed to react to German attacks. For example, on May 13th, General Lafontaine, leading the 55th Infantry Division, received the order at 8 p.m. to counterattack. However, instead of doing so immediately, he requested more detailed orders from Corps Command. As Karl-Heinz Fraser states, General Lafontaine had a mission, but wanted an order. At 1 a.m., 5 hours after receiving his mission, he personally went to Corps Command, which was on the opposite side of the front line, from where he only returned at 4 a.m., 8 hours after his superior officer, General Gransard, had instructed him to counterattack. Only then did he begin to give orders to his division. Even then, Lafontaine was still hesitant because he had not received a written order from Corps Command. General Gransard had given the order by telephone. Finally, after 5 a.m., General Lafontaine finally gave the order to counterattack. In this entire process, 9 hours were lost. Another critical issue that helps explain French tactical inferiority was the lack of effective coordination between arms. Frequently, the French failed to efficiently integrate infantry, armor, and air power to conduct operations. Tanks often acted with little or no coordination with infantry, and air units rarely managed to directly support ground units. Conditions on the ground, the lack of suitable equipment, and the structure and doctrine of the Air Force are some of the main reasons why it was so difficult for the French to conduct effective joint operations. A significant issue was communication. Almost all light tanks had no radios, as they were intended to move with the infantry, so they used flags. Close air support also was not a priority for the French Air Force in 1940. During the interwar period, the Air Force sought autonomy and rejected the concept of close air support in favor of air superiority and strategic bombing. According to John Buckley, the reactive posture of the French Air Force and its idea of dividing air units into small amounts to provide localized air cover across the front was unsustainable in the face of the Luftwaffe's concentrated approach. One problem among French forces was communication. The French were very reluctant to use radios, which made them even slower. In fact, the Germans assessed before the campaign that the French would be slow in part because they emphasized communication security, which meant they had few radios or other means to receive urgent orders. They were right. To avoid communication interceptions, the French prioritized the telephone, along with telegrams and messengers. Because of this and the doctrinal elements previously mentioned, the French reaction time was terribly slow. When an important order reached the involved units, it was often already too late. Moving units could rarely be contacted, and on average, at least during the first 8 or 9 days of the campaign, when General Gamelin was the commander-in-chief, about 48 hours would pass before an order traveled from the Grand Quartier General, French headquarters, to the concerned frontline units. The situation of the Ninth Army exemplifies the consequences of the French communications doctrine. On May 12th, there was a clash between German and French troops at midnight, but their commander, General Martin, took several hours to learn about it. He only found out at 5 a.m. General Korapp, the leader of the entire Ninth Army, only became aware of this combat at noon, 12 p.m., and the French High Command was informed only at 1:30 p.m. that the Germans had crossed the Meuse River. Needless to say, this situation ended in disaster for the French. And to conclude, prioritizing the telephone over radio meant that communications could be critically fragile, as they were concentrated in a single location. For example, when the Germans reached Abbeville on May 20th, where the telephone centers were located, they cut the lines, preventing phone calls and telegrams between the Grand Quartier General and the armies in northern France, causing a complete breakdown within the French chain of command. Before we continue, we must debunk a myth that is deeply rooted in Western mentality. One of the most persistent myths about the fall of France concerns the courage of the French. In reality, the Battle of France presents many examples of French military bravery. Here in the video, we will see some examples of this. After the declaration of war, the French commander-in-chief, General Gamelin, was optimistic, and there were signs that the French population was confident. Upon mobilization, the soldiers, in general, were not happy about the war, but accepted the task with determination, sometimes even with good humor. On May 14th, the morale of several French units was described as magnificent and splendid. They were eager to enter their first battle, and their officers encouraged them. For example, between May 15th and 17th, the village of Stonne was the site of intense fighting, being retaken several times by the French and Germans. An excellent illustration of French bravery was the superb and valiant defense of the Dunkirk perimeter during Operation Dynamo. In Lille, the French held out for 3 days, between May 28th and 31st, despite heavy fighting and being surrounded by 7 enemy divisions. The defenders only surrendered when they ran out of ammunition, and their remarkable resistance was recognized by the Germans themselves, who allowed them to withdraw from the city in formation, carrying their weapons. Facing an overwhelming force, the French forces launched preemptive attacks to frustrate the German initiative. On June 2nd, the French launched a vigorous counterattack and recaptured an area east of Heumel previously occupied by the Germans. Attacking with 550 men, supported by 2 reconnaissance groups and 6 Somua S-35 tanks, only 65 survived unscathed and withdrew, unable to hold the recovered ground. A counterattack by the 150th French Infantry Regiment still resulted in 60 prisoners. On June 1st and 2nd, in the Dunkirk area, the French, especially the 68th Infantry Division, repelled several large German attacks. In this situation, the morale of the soldiers did not collapse, despite the critical situation they faced. On June 5th, the first day of Fall Rot, several French positions were surrounded and fought until they ran out of ammunition. There are multiple instances in which French forces, including soldiers from the French colonies, only surrendered after exhausting their ammunition. Between June 14th and 25th, on the Alpine front against Italian troops, although the French defenders were outnumbered, with ratios generally around 1-8, the attackers suffered over 6,000 casualties compared to 274 on the defending side. The terrible weather helped, and gangrene was responsible for a large part of the Italian casualties, but regardless, the French defenses in the Alps were very strong. In fact, beyond individual skill, the French benefited from a solid network of fortifications and good artillery support, along with high morale. For example, in one instance, about 200 fortress troops repelled an infantry division. In some areas, only a dozen French soldiers repelled Italian battalions. Most notably, in a peculiar engagement at the Saint-Louis Bridge near the French town of Menton, only 9 French soldiers faced the Italian Coseraia infantry division. They stopped fighting on June 25th, the day the armistice came into effect, only after French officers personally informed them that the war was over. The same occurred in some sectors of the Maginot Line. The end of the campaign witnessed some of the fiercest fighting. The French continued to fight against the Germans despite the French government's public call for an armistice. In eastern France, some defenders continued fighting even when 2 of their generals had already ordered surrender. For example, Colonel Cazaille, commander of the 21st Colonial Infantry Regiment, personally led an attack against the enemy with his fellow officers and defeated them. but 2 kilometers ahead, all the officers were either killed or wounded. Cornered by the Germans, Colonel Cazils refused to surrender despite their offer, took a light machine gun from one of his gravely wounded men, and fought until he was fatally struck. General Deslaurens, commander of the 60th Infantry Division, was killed while leading a rear guard action to allow some of his troops to evacuate, personally operating the last functioning light machine gun of his unit. These many examples, which are not the only instances of French bravery and determination in 1940, illustrate that French soldiers, in general, were far from cowardly or quick to surrender. The French soldiers and frontline officers in the field could hardly have done better. They did what was asked of them and performed as best they could, given the critical circumstances they faced. Now returning to the reasons. French strategic leadership in 1940 ranged from poor to terrible. The 2 commanders-in-chief of the campaign, Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, along with the civilian leadership, especially Philippe Pétain, acted in ways that significantly undermined France's ability to successfully fight against Germany. One mistake Gamelin made was sacrificing a significant part of the French strategic reserve, the 7th Army, which contained some of France's most mobile and effective troops, thereby preventing the French from responding to an unexpected German move in the event of operational surprise. Gamelin apparently had good reasons for doing so. However, he made a terrible mistake by ignoring a basic military principle. Always keep enough reserves to deal with an unforeseen event. This dramatic mistake meant that the French would not have many reserve units to face the unexpected German advance through the Ardennes. Furthermore, Gamelin showed a critical lack of energy. Instead of quickly issuing orders to change the situation after the breakthrough at Sedan, reinvigorating his officers, and boosting morale, in other words, doing what would be expected of the commander-in-chief of any army, he acted with little energy to reverse the critical situation France found itself in. Another testimony to poor strategic military leadership was Gamelin's replacement, General Maxime Weygand. Weygand replaced his predecessor on May 19th after the latter was dismissed. If Maurice Gamelin's failures were recklessness and lack of energy, Maxime Weygand's were defeatism. As early as May 25th, less than a week after his appointment, he showed a pessimism that could have been interpreted by some as defeatism. After the start of Fall Rot and the Germans forcefully crossed the Somme River, he began to speak openly in a defeatist tone. However, when things really began to go badly for France, he could at least have tried to continue the fight in North Africa and in other French colonies. Yet, Weygand scoffed at the idea of retreating to North Africa and deemed the option unrealistic. The problem is that he apparently didn't even seriously consider this possibility. He went so far as to claim it was impossible because there were no ships to transfer troops there, which was completely wrong. Not only was the French Navy almost intact, but Winston Churchill had offered any British ships necessary to transport French soldiers and material. Weygand apparently did not make a serious analysis of the North Africa option. Instead, he seemed to be motivated by emotion and intuition. He dismissed the French colonies as childishness and, in his assessment, obviously without tangible elements to support it, the United Kingdom would sue for peace within 8 days after France gave up the fight. He categorically expressed his refusal to continue the fight outside continental France, excluding any attempt to act on it. Furthermore, he raised the specter of disorder and chaos to convince other decision-makers to support his opinion. In a cabinet meeting, Weygand stated that a communist insurrection had broken out in Paris and that an armistice should be requested to control civil disorder. Following this statement, Interior Minister Georges Mandel called the chief of police in Paris, who indicated that everything was calm. It is unclear whether Weygand actually believed his own statement or if he was deliberately lying to get what he wanted. Either way, even in good faith, The commander-in-chief of the army in a democracy should not attempt to influence civilian leadership and the decision-making process by raising the specter of an insurrection if that is not based on solid and realistic analysis, which was clearly not the case here. French strategic civilian leadership also had shortcomings that undermined France's ability to win the war in 1940. The president of the French Council, Paul Reynaud, lacked decisiveness and failed to become a strong figure during critical moments. He wished to continue the fight in Brittany or North Africa, but faced opposition, especially from Philippe Pétain and General Weygand. Reynaud failed to impose his will and hesitated to decide whether or not to continue the fight. Unlike Winston Churchill, who was a strong-willed figure, Reynaud did not provide the necessary leadership. While Reynaud suffered from indecision, his successor, Philippe Pétain, was clearly defeatist. Appointed vice president of the council on May 18th, Pétain undermined efforts to continue the fight in North Africa, favoring an armistice. He secretly discussed a post-occupation regime and promised future positions in a later government. When he became premier on June 16th, Pétain mistakenly called for an armistice on the radio without initiating serious negotiations with the Germans. This harmed the morale of French troops, who faced a considerable decrease in combat capability even before serious negotiations with the Germans had begun. Consequently, with Pétain's appointment as premier, France's highest leadership, both civilian and military, was composed of two defeatists. It is difficult to imagine how any country could continue a war when both the head of government and the commander-in-chief refused to do so. At the time, the idea of an armistice probably seemed like a reasonable option to many. It's easy to criticize this idea 80 years later, knowing the final outcome of the Second World War and who won and who lost. Thank you very much for your audience. May God bless you all. A big hug, and see you soon.